Jack Mazarevich was born in 1925 in a very poor and rural part of western Ukraine in a small town called WWII, which today is less than 5 miles from the Polish border. Jack lived with his parents, Mikhailo and Barbara, and during this time Ukraine was part of the Communist Soviet Union. One of the consequences of Soviet rule was the agricultural revolution, which resulted in the formation of large collective farms at the expense of small holdings and the destruction of many small villages. At some point in the 1940s, this meant that the whole population of the village where Jack's family lived was forcibly marched to the Black Sea port of Odessa. This is a distance of some 530 miles, and the journey was undertaken largely on foot. After a long and perilous journey, when Jack and his parents finally arrived at their destination, the villagers found that they were not welcome there, and after a brief period found themselves being returned, once again on foot, to WWII. Jack's mother, Barbara, was heavily pregnant at the time, and it was during this march back that she gave birth to Jack's sister, Catherine. With only the briefest overnight stop to recover from childbirth, they then had to rejoin the march back home. The conditions of the march had had an effect on Barbara's pregnancy, and as a result, Catherine was born with birth complications. During the Second World War, given the proximity of WWII to the Polish border, Jack's village was occupied by Nazi troops. Young men were being taken away from their families to either be conscripted to the army or to work camps to aid in the Nazi-German war effort. When Jack was only 16 years old, he was removed from his family and sent to Germany as forced labour on a farm. In an act of selflessness, Jack offered to go in place of his father in order to allow his parents to remain together with his baby sister. Jack didn't know it at the time, but that would be the last he ever saw his family again. Fortunately, Jack survived the war and the Allied occupation of Germany. Somehow he managed to find a route to the UK and ended up in a refugee labour camp in Ayrshire. Luckily, Jack escaped the horrors that a return to the Soviet Union would have brought. He learned later that the other young men in his position were treated as Nazi collaborators and sentenced to death.
When Jack was in Germany, I think that was quite a difficult period for him. He lived on a farm with a farmer who I think was generally okay to him in terms of the way that he treated him. But my dad told me a lot of stories about, not all at the one time, but he told me bits and pieces. And I think there wasn't a lot of food around in the farm, so I think they only got one kind of main meal a day. So that was quite difficult if you think that he would actually be working manually out in the fields, doing lots of manual work, and then he was only getting one main meal a day. I think what he lived in, what he slept in was a kind of barn outside, and he was upstairs in the loft part of the barn. There was a local guy who was, my dad said he worked for the Nazis, basically the SS rather than for the German army. And this guy was always looking out for people who were doing the wrong thing. I think he would have quite liked to have recruited my dad into the German army, but my dad was a bit young for it, and he really didn't want anything to do with it.
Years after the war had ended, Jack had made a life for himself and started a family in Scotland. At some point in the 1960s, he was able to make contact with his father in the Ukraine, only to find out his mother and sister had died of ill health. It had become known among Scottish Ukrainians that the Soviet authorities were targeting individuals who received letters and parcels from relatives in Western countries, and so Jack took the painful decision to stop writing to his father to save him from possible arrest and death.
My dad spoke a wee bit about his family from time to time, but particularly before I went to secondary school, my dad got in touch with his own father back in the Ukraine. So around about that time, we got to know a wee bit more about my dad's family. And I particularly remember when we got in touch and sent letters back and forth, we had this picture of a Ukrainian man, and to me he seemed like a big tall man. I don't know that he particularly was, but he was a big tall man to me as a wee boy, and he had this big moustache, a big little bushy moustache that came round, and I thought that was pretty cool when I was only about 8 or 9, you know. And I found out that his name was Mikhailo, which is obviously the same as Michael, so that was who I was named after. And I thought that was really quite cool to be named after a Ukrainian grandfather that I really hadn't known much about. My dad also began to send parcels back and forth because he found out at that time that there was only his father left. His mother had died and his sister had died. So this Ukrainian father, Mikhailo, was the only person that was left. One of the things that we found out later on was that probably some of that was intercepted, and some of the border guards must have opened the parcels up and taken bits and pieces out. And the final thing I remember about that period was we always got marched off to the photographers, me and my mum and dad, because of course my grandfather had never met me, his grandson, and he'd never met my mum. So we all went off to the posh photographers in the centre of Glasgow, and we got our pictures taken standing in the front of the props in these very professional, studied photographs. When my dad was living in Germany, he used to have lots of documents that he had to produce from time to time. And if you remember some of the war films that you can see when the Germans are asking for your papers, that was effectively what my dad had to have. So he had, I think the main one he had was like a small booklet, probably much like a passport is today, and it was stamped with the eagle of the Third Reich, and my dad had to carry that around with him and produce that anytime he was asked to, and I think the penalties were quite severe if you didn't have that with you. I don't know if you remember, some of these films have got the little emblem that Jewish people had to wear with the J and the sign of for Jewish people. My dad had some that had P for Polski, because he was regarded as a Polish person at that stage, and he had to pin that onto his shirt or his jacket when he was out and about. So he had to carry these with him all the time as well. The other interesting thing about that is that when my dad came to live in this country, he also had to report to the police every week. And he had various documents that he had to show if he was moving house, if he was got a new job, or if he was changing address. For whatever reason, he had to report to the police and let them know that. And he also had to go every Saturday at a certain time to let the police know that he was still in the country, still where he was, and check in with them. And on the one time that he didn't do that because he was, for some, I don't know what the reason was, apparently the police came to the door, knocking at the door, looking for my dad, and my mum was worried to death because, that was really quite serious to have the police coming to your door at that time. And that continued right up until the late 60s that my dad had to do that. So that's, quite a long time after the war had ended.
Despite the hard upbringing Jack had had, he was always smiling and hard at work. Jack had a long life, he endured many hardships and overcame many difficulties, and rather than being weighed down by his past, he made a future for himself and his family. Jack passed away peacefully at 91 years of age, surrounded by family.